In most spheres of study and thought, there are allowed more than just one idea on a given subject of inquiry, except, of course, evolution. Now, I knew people would get upset, but it still strikes me as odd that it actually does happen, and strikes such a nerve, too. People have tons of differing thought on so many things, but if you question the sacred cow of evolution, the whole world explodes. If you want to check out my previous video on evolution, click the link. Otherwise, let's continue on with this episode and check out what Lawrence Krauss has to say about teaching other ideas about how life began.
It amazes me that people have pre-existing notions that defy the evidence of reality, but that they hold on to them so dearly. And one of them is the notion of creationism, or in fact, look, Senator Marco Rubio, who's presumably a reasonably intelligent man, and maybe even educated, was asked, what's the age of the earth? And ultimately, either because he actually believed it or he was trying to appeal to some constituency, had to argue that it's a big mystery, that somehow we should teach kids both ideas that the earth is 6,000 years old and that it's 4.55 billion years old, which is what it is.
The origins of life is not a mystery. Except, what proof do you have as to how it started?
If you think about that, somehow saying that, well, anything goes, we shouldn't offend religious beliefs by requiring kids to understand reality. That's child abuse.
So now it's child abuse if you teach anything other than evolution. Because that makes sense. That makes plenty of sense. If you don't do what I want and you don't teach what I believe, then that's child abuse. Okay. I think this is an example in bad logic.
And if you think about it, teaching kids or allowing the notion that the earth is 6,000 years old to be promulgated in schools is like teaching kids that the distance across the United States is 17 feet. That's how big an error it is.
Nope, it's not really like that at all. That's a pretty bad analogy for what's happening. It would be like teaching where numbers even come from to be able to measure the distance. That's really the argument being had. And so the question, where do numbers even come from, or why do numbers work to measure the distance, that's really what the discussion is. It has nothing to do with just simple calculations or observable realities. Evolution can't be observed. It can't be tested, at least at a macro level. So it's not really the same thing at all.
Now you might say, look, a lot of people believe that, so don't we owe it to them to allow their views to be present in school? Well, as I've often said, the purpose of education is not to validate ignorance, but to overcome it.
So then maybe we should not validate the ignorance of not knowing what the problems with evolution are. Maybe we should teach that in school too, because we don't want people to be ignorant, so let's teach them all the facts. Let's teach them, here's the strengths of evolution, and here are the weaknesses with evolution, because we don't want them to be ignorant. Yeah, I don't think you guys would ever go for that. Now, I thought we were supposed to be for intellectual freedom of inquiry for everyone in education. I thought Lawrence was a proponent of being skeptical about everything, and how that was more important for kids to learn than obedience, as I've heard him actually say. I guess that's maybe true, though, unless it's, of course, talking about things he holds dear, like evolution. It's funny how people hold to certain principles until, well, so it doesn't go their way. I'm Nathan Collins, bringing you the truth of Christ in a post-truth culture. Before I get into this video, I would just like to briefly say if you like what we've been doing on this channel and think there is a need for Christians to speak truth to the culture, I would like to ask you to support us financially to help us out with equipment costs and improve and grow our content and work here on this channel. I would ask you to support us on Patreon. Click the link down below and become a member of the Third Option team and help us reach a world with Christ's truth. Thanks. Now, let's make some people's heads explode. A big issue area for evolution that has always been there since the very beginning has been the problem of explaining language and how it could have arose through evolution. Alfred Wallace, one of the beginning founders of the theory of evolution along with Darwin, also rejected the idea that evolution can explain language. Wallace asked how man's superior intelligence could result from natural selection, the basic principle of evolution, that would expand a creature's powers only to the point at which it has an advantage over the competition in the struggle for existence. So specifically, Wallace wondered why humans have a large and well-developed brain quite disproportionate to his actual requirements. He could see no problem solved by language that could not be solved without it. That is, why language would have been naturally selected. Unless language was needed for the survival of a species, the theory of evolution could not explain its origin. Upon hearing Wallace's concerns, Darwin replied, "I hope that you have not just murdered too completely your own and my child." The child being the theory of evolution that had just been created by this time. Yet Darwin was never able to specify just how language evolved. Since Darwin, many have tried, and needless to say, their evolutionary explanations have been weighed in the balance and are found wanting. The problem has never been solved by proponents of evolution. Now, another less well-known but just as detrimental argument against evolution is its lack of explanatory power concerning consciousness. It's utterly incapable of truly being of use to the problem. How could consciousness evolve? What would be the random mutation process that brings about an immaterial thing like consciousness? Thomas Nagel, University Professor of Philosophy and Law, Emeritus at New York University, in his book, Mind and Cosmos, he argues against the neo-Darwinian view of the emergence of consciousness by evolutionary theory. Despite Nagel's being an atheist and not a proponent of intelligent design, he states that any philosophy of nature that cannot account for the mind is fundamentally misguided. And I obviously agree. There are so many things about it that doesn't fit a common sense understanding of our world. Thomas goes on to say, "I realize that such doubts about natural selection will strike many people as outrageous, but that is because almost everyone in our secular culture has been browbeaten into regarding the reductive research program as sacrosanct, on the ground that anything else would just not be science." I find this interesting that he admits this. It's definitely true. But the secular academic world often likes to pretend they're just objective and impartial, just following the facts and what they believe, which of course is not true. You're human. Welcome. Thomas also remarks that, "For a long time, I have found the materialist account of how we and our fellow organisms came to exist hard to believe, including the standard version of how the evolutionary process works. The more details we learn about the chemical basis of life and the intricacy of the genetic code, the more unbelievable the standard historical account becomes. This is just the opinion of a layman who reads widely in the literature that explains contemporary science to the non-specialist. Perhaps that literature presents the situation with a simplicity and confidence that does not reflect the most sophisticated scientific thought in these areas. But it seems to me that, as it is usually presented, the current orthodoxy about the cosmic order is the product of governing assumptions that are unsupported, and that it flies in the face of common sense. Thomas Nagel, The Mind and Cosmos. This book, of course, didn't go over very well among the intellectual scientific priesthood. Their beloved genius, Thomas Nagel, turned on their sacred doctrine and didn't toe the line like a good comrade. I really wish, though, that they would listen to their own people who have questions, have serious concerns and questions with what they are believing and what assumptions they're making. They obviously have a very good reason for stating these things to their fellow comrades, especially knowing how they will be thought of after they speak them. So maybe there's something to this. I don't know. Could be going out on a limb there. DNA is another massive problem for the theory of evolution as well. How does information come from a non-informational source? DNA was seen as junk by Darwinists at first. Again, you don't know what you don't know. If you have a simplistic view of living creatures, maybe evolution seems plausible, but we know a lot better now. DNA, of course, isn't junk, but has been one of the greatest discoveries of all time. DNA has revolutionized so many industries. It's hard to comprehend how much it has changed our current world in the 21st century. DNA also is a huge problem for the proponents of evolution. One major problem being that DNA is like an information code that sets up the infinite structures of complex organisms. Well, how did the progression of DNA happen? How do you generate new, useful information? The Cambrian explosion that I mentioned in the previous episode. In the fossil record, it makes this even worse for Darwinian thinking. Not only does evolution have the impossible task of generating magically new information, something which has never happened. Now, with the Cambrian explosion, it has to do it at a light speed pace for evolution. The math, once again, doesn't lie, and the numbers don't add up. There isn't enough time. Evolutionist proponents always say, well, given enough time, it could happen. And the reality is, eternity isn't enough time for evolution to happen. All right, so get ready for people's heads to explode. Well, that's all for this episode, but if you like this episode, the mobs of angry people should be arriving shortly, so quickly go ahead and subscribe and check out our other episodes as we address different issues in our world and bring you the truth of Christ in definitely a post-truth culture. Grace and peace, brothers and sisters. I hear the footsteps coming and the keyboards racing. Well, if you're wondering about the hat, my hair is a mess today. It's like 5:40 in the morning, so. And if you think this is a set behind me, you're wrong. This is what the room actually looks like.